Around the turn of the 20th century, Russia and Japan got into a dispute over who should be in control of Korea and China. Looking to avoid an armed conflict, the Japanese sent the Russians a deal that came with reasonable concessions on both sides. But the Russians didn't like it, they rejected the deal, and they countered with a pretty unreasonable deal that came with lots of concessions for Japan and not so many for Russia. And so Japan rejected that deal and then promptly launched a devastating surprise attack on the Russian Navy stationed at Fort Arthur in China. This attack would officially start the one-year-long Russo-Japanese War. The Russians knew they would need to send a replacement naval fleet up to Fort Arthur to reclaim it from the Japanese, but unfortunately, the attack at Fort Arthur had totally wiped out all of Russia's best sailors and all their best ships, putting Russia at a major disadvantage to start this war. And so as Russians are wondering what they're going to do next, the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, authorizes an unbelievable mission. He orders the Russian Baltic Fleet to set sail from their harbor in northern Europe and sail 18,000 miles around the world to Japan, where they will defeat the Japanese and then reclaim Fort Arthur. The fact that none of the Baltic Fleet ships were designed to sail that far of a distance, or that there were literally 0 refueling points along their massive projected path, was considered largely inconsequential and ignored. What was also considered inconsequential was how absurdly unqualified the Baltic crew was. The sailors were mostly illiterate peasants that did not grow up on the coasts, and so they showed up for military training with no seafaring skills. And then after their military training, they still had no seafaring skills because the Baltic Fleet's harbor was frozen solid almost year-round. But the Tsar believed the man he had put in charge of this crew, Admiral Rojesvenski, would make up for their deficiencies. And this belief was not unwarranted. Admiral Rojesvenski was the best Russian officer that had not been killed in that Japan surprise attack. He had significant combat experience, and he had a wickedly bad temper. He didn't care who you were. If you were doing something he didn't like, he was going to beat the crap out of you. Literally. And when he was told he was going to be in charge of this fairly inexperienced crew, he was certain his rough style would whip these Baltic boys into shape and they would be very successful. But when he laid eyes on the Baltic Fleet, he realized this was going to be a little bit more challenging than he realized. In addition to being less than satisfied with his fighting crew, he was equally dissatisfied with the 2 senior officers that were assigned to be his direct support. And he immediately gave them nicknames, and he would only refer to them by their nicknames, right to their face. The first one was the manure sack, and the other was a vast empty space. As for the Baltic Fleet's 45 ships, they were terrible. Because this unit never went out on the ocean because their harbor was always frozen, Russia didn't waste their good ships on them. So all they had were really old, obsolete warships and then non-military ships like ferries and yachts that they just slapped random guns onto. They also had ships that the Baltic Fleet crew enthusiastically called futuristic, which were these ships that came out of Russia briefly copying French engineering, which involved these crazy top-heavy ships that sat so low in the water that their lowest rung of weapons, their cannons that poked out the windows at the bottom of the ship, they didn't work because they sat under the water permanently. But regardless of their shortfalls, the Baltic Fleet was what Rojesvenski had been dealt, and so he had to just get them moving if they were going to win the war. And so on October 16th, 1904, Admiral Rojesvenski ordered all of his men to take their positions in all of their ships, and they set sail. And immediately, 30 seconds into their trip, the lead ship ran aground, and another ship lost its anchor, even though it should not have been casting its anchor to begin with. And so while one ship is trying to refloat, and the other is trying to find its anchor in the ocean, a third ship comes along and broadsides a fourth ship. And it does so much damage to this fourth ship, that ship had to go back home. But once they overcame these initial obstacles, the Baltic Fleet, that now numbered 44 ships, made it out of the harbor without any more issues, and then set sail for the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. As they drew closer, Manure Sack informed Rojesvenski that there might be an issue, that he had heard rumblings amongst the crew that they believed Japanese torpedo boats were stationed off the coast of Denmark waiting for them to get there. Rojesvenski told Manure Sack that that was impossible, the Japanese torpedo boats did not have the capabilities to sail 18,000 miles to Denmark. And even if they did have the ability to do that, they could not have gotten there in such a short period of time. But Manure Sack told Rojesvenski that unfortunately, even though logically that makes sense, this rumor had spread all across the crew. And so Rojesvenski began sending out messages to all the other ships, telling them there are no Japanese torpedo boats waiting for us off the coast of Denmark. Everybody just needs to calm down. And these messages did appear to work at first, because eventually another rumor began to circulate, one that Rojesvenski was not really aware of as it was happening, and that was that the crew began to believe there was a huge minefield underneath them. Everywhere they went, there was a minefield. And everybody got so worked up about it that it made its way back to a lot of the captains actually piloting the different ships. And at some point, the pilots just began doing these evasive maneuvers, and Rojesvenski's looking around wondering what they're doing, and they began crashing into each other, trying to avoid this minefield. When Rojesvenski finally figured out what was going on, he sent out even more messages telling them that there's no minefield under us. It's totally safe. Everybody just needs to calm down. And so it took Rojesvenski going out on deck and firing shots into the air to finally get people to stop believing they were on top of a minefield. But just a couple of hours later, after Rojesvenski had gone back up to the bridge and was just looking out, surveying his fleet as they carried on towards Denmark and Sweden, when all of a sudden, towards the very front of his fleet, he heard this unbelievable barrage of cannon fire. One of his own ships was engaging something out in front of the fleet, but Rojesvenski was too far away to see what it was. And then a message came through from the attacking ship, whose name was Kamchatka, and they said they were surrounded on all sides by at least 8 Japanese torpedo boats. And so Rojesvenski runs out onto the deck, looking out towards the horizon, expecting to see these 8 Japanese ships, but he doesn't. And then all of a sudden, the shooting just completely stops and it's silent. And then Rojesvenski notices on his right side, a small little fishing boat is making its way right up alongside his. It would turn out Kamchatka, the attacking ship, had confused this little unarmed Russian fishing ship with 8 Japanese torpedo boats and had opened fire. But luckily, even though they fired hundreds and hundreds of rounds at this little boat, none of them hit the boat. And so the fishermen were fine. And the fishermen had actually been sent to the boat specifically by Tsar Nicholas II to tell Rojesvenski that he had been promoted. And so Rojesvenski apologizes to the fishermen for having shot at them hundreds and hundreds of times. And they said it was okay. And the fishermen carried on. After Rojesvenski chewed out the crew of the Kamchatka, the rest of the Baltic fleet gathered up and they continued towards the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. When they got close, a Danish resupply ship came out to meet them to give them fuel and food and water, and the Baltic fleet mistook them for a Japanese torpedo boat, causing them to ram them repeatedly. And then they realized their mistake, but at that point they had done severe damage to the resupply ship, who had to immediately turn around and go back to shore. After that, the Baltic fleet did manage to get past Denmark and Sweden, and they made it out to the North Sea. But as soon as they got out there was trouble. One of the captains of the ships that was towards the front of the Baltic fleet's formation spotted 4 Japanese torpedo boats coming right at them. And so this ship, along with 6 others, immediately just began engaging these 4 ships with everything they had. Cannons, big guns, small guns, everything. It was absolute chaos from the front of this formation. And the amount of gunfire that was going off towards the front caused the rest of the ships that were not part of the attack to begin to panic. And the other ship captains began ramming into each other to try to get away from this attack. And so while that's going on, all the crew members on all the ships begin drawing their swords and running around, expecting the Japanese to board them at any moment. And the others that did not draw their swords put on life jackets and laid down on their back on the deck of the ship, believing that was procedure for how to survive a sinking ship. And so for the next 20 minutes, it was just continuous gunfire coming from the front of their formation. One of the attacking ships sent a message back to Rojesvenski that said they had been hit by a torpedo and they were taking heavy fire and it was just absolute bedlam up there. And then all of a sudden it just totally stopped. And when the smoke cleared, Rojesvenski and his ship had been able to maneuver up a little bit closer and they could see what they were shooting at. And it would turn out, once again, it was a case of mistaken identity. They were not being attacked by Japanese torpedo boats. They had spotted 4 small British fishing boats. And in the chaos of the gunfight, the Baltic fleet had inadvertently begun to fire at each other, killing several crew members and badly damaging their ships in the process. As for the British fishermen, only one of their boats actually sunk, despite the fact that the Baltic fleet had fired thousands and thousands of rounds at them, and they had been stationary the entire time. The Russian Tsar immediately apologized to Britain, but the British media went crazy, and the British people called for war, believing that this type of attack could not possibly be an accident. But Russian diplomats leveled with the British and said, no, this really was an accident. And eventually they convinced them, avoiding starting yet another war. Rojesvenski and his Baltic fleet were allowed to continue in their journey, and after a couple of weeks, they were getting close to Africa when one of his ships, the Kamchatka, the same ship that believed they were surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats, they got separated from the main fleet and got lost. And so Rojesvenski and the other officers did what they could to try to locate them, but nobody had seen where they went, and there wasn't great technology to try to locate them, and so unfortunately, Rojesvenski and the Baltic fleet just had to continue on and hope that at some point the lost ship would find them again. A few days later, the main body arrived in Tangier, and lo and behold, Kamchatka showed up. And they informed Rojesvenski that they had gotten lost, and they didn't really have a good answer for that. But once they were lost, they managed to engage 3 separate Japanese torpedo boats. But it would turn out they were not Japanese torpedo boats. They were in fact a German, a Swedish, and a French fishing boat, but none of Kamchatka's rounds actually impacted any of the 3 vessels, and so 3 more wars were averted. And so now that Rojesvenski had his lost ship back, he gathered up his full Baltic fleet, and they left Tangier. But on their way out, one of the ships managed to cut the underwater telegraph line to Tangier, cutting off Tangier's communication with Europe for the next 4 days. By now, the Baltic fleet was very low on coal, but they had a planned rendezvous with a German resupply ship off the coast of West Africa. When they got there, the crew decided they didn't want to do another resupply later on, and so let's just take double coal this time. And so they hauled all this extra coal onto their ships, despite not having a place for it, and so naturally they began throwing it in the halls and in their bedrooms, and basically anywhere there was space. And what that did is it led to a fine layer of coal dust all over everything in the ship. And that, combined with the intense humidity off the coast of Africa, led to this black coal gunk getting trapped inside of all of the sailors' lungs, which began killing several of them. A couple weeks later, as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, it finally rained on them, washing away a lot of that coal dust on their ships, which was a big relief. But the rain turned into a pretty bad storm, and so Rojesvenski decided he just wanted all of his ships to call in and say they were okay. And so one by one, each of the ships were told to message him saying the words, "We are okay." And so one by one, each of the ships did this until it got to Kamchatka's turn. And they accidentally sent the message, "Do you see Japanese torpedo boats?" And of course, this message spread like wildfire across the entire crew, which led to mass hysteria, and Rojesvenski's trying to send out messages to say, no, there's no Japanese torpedo boats, but it's too late. The other captains are panicking, and they're ramming into each other and firing blindly into the wind. From that point forward, every night, Rojesvenski would go up onto the bow of his ship and he would scream obscenities at Kamchatka. When the Baltic fleet finally made it to Madagascar, the morale amongst the crew was very low. And so when they docked in Madagascar, the crew decided it would be a good idea to boost their morale by buying some pets to bring back on board the ship with them. And the pets they decided to bring back were crocodiles and poisonous snakes. When their handlers smuggled them back on board their ship, they immediately escaped down into the bowels of the ship. When they went looking for them, they couldn't find them because the ships were in such bad shape. There were all sorts of cracks and holes all over the interior for these animals to escape to. And so the men just had to accept there were very dangerous predators just living on their ship with them. And so most men were unable to sleep at night in fear of being attacked by these animals, which led a number of them to go for real insane. And so the pets idea didn't really boost morale amongst the Baltic fleet, and so one of the officers decided he would take another crack at boosting spirits. And so he went to a vendor in Madagascar and he purchased 2,000 of their finest cigarettes to bring back on board. So he brings them back on board, he hands them all out, and everyone's so thankful. But it turns out those cigarettes were laced with enormous amounts of opium, which led to hundreds of the crew members becoming hopelessly addicted to opium. Also in Madagascar, these sailors picked up dozens of diseases that began wiping them out in droves. During one funeral for a crew member, the Kamchatka asked if they could fire a salute with blank rounds. They were given permission, but they accidentally fired live rounds into the ship right next to them. When Rojesvenski and the rest of the Baltic fleet finally left Madagascar, their only refrigerator on board one of their ships broke, which spoiled all of their meat, tons and tons of meat. And so they began throwing it overboard, which attracted hundreds and hundreds of sharks, which circled their ships for the rest of their journey. Rojesvenski desperately wanted to find a way to somehow train the remainder of the Baltic fleet how to be somewhat militarily competent. And so he decided he would make them all do target practice because that had been a big issue on this trip so far. And so he had one ship attach a long line that was connected to a target in the water, and that ship would pull the target along, and the other ships would take shots at the target. And so all of the ships on Rojesvenski's call began firing at this target, and after thousands and thousands of rounds, they didn't hit the target once. However, they managed to continuously shoot the ship that was pulling the target. For Rojesvenski, this was the final straw. He felt like he could do absolutely nothing to make the Baltic fleet an actual military force. And so he sent a message back to the Tsar and said, "You gotta replace me. I need to resign and somebody else needs to come in and take over." And the Tsar said, "No. This is your fleet." And so begrudgingly, Rojesvenski continued on leading the Baltic fleet until they finally, after 7 total months on the sea, were within striking distance of their target in Japan. The night before, as they prepared for their attack, they went into stealth mode where all the ships killed all of their lights. So they're totally dark, with the exception of their hospital ship. That kept their lights on. This was considered a rule of war at the time, which both sides abided by. And so while the Baltic fleet was sitting out in the waters outside of Japan, a small fishing boat began coming towards them. Now, the fishing boat could only see the lit-up hospital ship. They could not see the 43 other darkened ships. And so a crew member on board this hospital ship came up to the railing, and he recognized the fishing boat was actually a Russian fishing boat. And so he waved them down, and when the Russian fishermen came outside, the crew member told him, "You gotta stop because there's 43 ships behind me that have their lights off. Do not go this way, go around." And so the Russian fisherman thanked him and turned around and went on his merry way. Except that wasn't a Russian fisherman, it was a Japanese sailor on board a Japanese torpedo boat. And now they knew exactly where the Baltic fleet was. And so that night, the Japanese Navy completely surrounded the Baltic fleet, and then the next day at daybreak, they launched their attack. It was called the Battle of Tsushima, and it was obscenely lopsided. The Japanese Navy completely wiped out the Baltic fleet, killing 4,000 of their crew members and capturing 7,300 others, which included Rojesvenski, who had been badly wounded in the battle, but he would survive. In contrast, the Japanese only had 100 casualties. This victory for Japan really marked the end of the war for Russia, and shortly after the Battle of Tsushima, the Russians agreed to surrender. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please beg the like button to let you have their secret chocolate chip cookie recipe. Tell them you won't share it with anyone, and as soon as they do give it to you, immediately post it on Facebook with the caption, "Here's my chocolate chip cookie recipe." In 2010, Kayla was a senior at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a big party school. And one Friday evening, Kayla and her friends were at a big party, and Kayla was having a great time, but she was starting to feel really tired. And so she asked her friends if maybe they wanted to leave early, but none of them did. And so Kayla left on her own. Luckily, her house was just down the road, and so she was at her front door in a matter of minutes. That night, her 2 roommates, who were also college seniors, had decided to stay in and just have a nice night with a couple of friends having some wine. And so when Kayla walked inside, she happened to turn to the right, and she looked on the closest wall where there was a sofa, and she saw there was a guy laying there with a blanket up to his chin, and his eyes were wide open. She didn't recognize him, but he was staring at her, and she figured, oh, he must be a friend of her roommates. But as she walked across the room, she kind of glanced back at him, and he had pulled the covers down slightly, and he had lifted his head up, and he was staring at her kind of menacingly. And so Kayla got a really bad vibe from this guy and just kind of hustled into her room, shut the door behind her, and locked it, something she never did. And a few minutes later, she was in her bed and she was passed out. A couple of hours later, she woke up to what sounded like tapping on wood. And so she sat up in her bed and she's kind of looking around. She had a couple drinks the night before and she's half asleep, so she's a bit disoriented. But finally, when she gets her bearings, she realizes this tapping sound is the sound of someone drumming their fingers on the outside of her door. And so she's looking at her door, wondering who would be doing that. And then all of a sudden, the drumming stops and it's replaced by the sound of this person scratching on the outside of the door. And so now Kayla's thinking, okay, is this guy who was out on that couch, is he playing a joke on me? And so she's sitting there wondering if she should just go over there and open the door and tell him to stop. But before she gets out of her bed, the scratching gets louder and louder and louder until it's so loud that it's kind of menacing. And so Kayla decides she's not going to go out there. And so instead, she pulls out her phone and she texts her roommate and says, hey, can you please come out in the living room and take care of your friend who's harassing me? But she doesn't get a response from that roommate, and the scratching is just still loud as ever. And so she texts her other roommate the same message, come out and take care of your buddy here. But again, she doesn't get a response. And now the scratching on the door has stopped and it's been replaced by jiggling of her doorknob. And so now Kayla is just mad because this is obviously a prank and it's a dumb prank. And so she yells out, hey, stop! But it doesn't do anything. And so now Kayla's like, okay, I gotta call my roommates, wake them up, they'll come out and they'll handle it. And so she calls one of her roommates and they do pick up this time. And Kayla angrily tells them, hey, come out into the living room and tell your friend to knock it off. He's totally harassing me. And her roommate was confused. She's trying to make sense of what Kayla's saying. And she says, Kayla, what are you talking about? What friend are you talking about? And Kayla says, the guy sleeping on the couch, the guy in our living room sleeping on the couch. And her roommate said, Kayla, we didn't have anybody over last night. Is somebody out there? You need to call the police. Kayla's adrenaline surged, and she very calmly told her roommate, lock your door immediately. And right then she noticed the jiggling of her doorknob and the scratching, and it all stopped. And Kayla's wondering, where did this guy go? And then after a couple of seconds, she heard extremely loud banging coming from across the house where her two roommates shared a room. And it was the sound of this guy trying to smash down their door. And so Kayla's screaming, her roommates are screaming. Kayla manages to dial up 911, and before long there are sirens outside, and Kayla hears the sound of this guy run across the house, and she hears the sliding door open and shut. The police come inside, they search the property, and there's no sign of this guy, and so Kayla and the roommates come outside. They talk to the police, and the police bring them over to their side door, and they show them on the outside there was all sorts of scratch marks all over the doorknob and right around the latch. And they said it looks like he was able to jimmy his way into your house through this door. And so then they asked the girls to give their statement about what happened, and they started with Kayla. They went over to her bedroom door so she could demonstrate what happened, and that's when they noticed there were all these scratch marks and gouge marks all over the outside of her bedroom door, and all over the doorknob, and all over the latch. And on the ground was a pair of scissors and a knife. And the police told Kayla that it looks like he used those scissors and that knife to open up the side door, and he was trying to use those tools again to open up her door, but for whatever reason, he just couldn't do it. They told Kayla that most likely when she went in the front door, she caught this guy off guard. Maybe he was trying to rob the place, maybe he had just broken in, but either way, Kayla got in and ruined his plans. And so he leapt onto that sofa, the one against that inner wall, to kind of tuck himself away in hopes that maybe Kayla wouldn't look over and see him. And they told her that most likely when she made eye contact with him, she became a witness and therefore a target of opportunity. And had she not locked her door, who knows what would have happened. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterwards, they hopped in her mother's truck and they got on the country highway and began making their way home. Their house was just 20 minutes down this highway. It was a straight shot. And this highway was pretty desolate. There were no street lights. It was actually a dirt road despite being a highway. And it was just thick forest on both sides of the road the entire way. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands on the wheel. She would sit up and kind of hunch over the wheel and keep her eyes intently intently focused on the road, but at night, her driving anxiety would shoot through the roof because she had really bad eyesight. And so she would go to great lengths to not drive at night to avoid that high level of anxiety. But the church service they had just come from had run a little bit long, and so now Misty's mother is driving with the sun starting to set, and she's going as fast as she can to try to get home before it gets too dark. And so as they're bombing down this road at about 55 miles an hour, despite it being about a 40-mile-per-hour zone, Misty, who's in the passenger seat, just happens to look over at her mother for no particular reason. And as she's looking at her, she notices out her mother's window, it looks like there's a little girl sitting on the side of the road. What's a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere? She says to her mom, I think I just saw a little girl. And Misty's mother, who's high up on the wheel, she did not hear Misty the first time. She's just focused on driving and trying to get home. And so Misty says again, I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay. And so Misty's mom looks over at her and she's not prepared to turn the car around. That means staying out later, and it means she's going to be driving in even darker conditions. And so she's like, did you really see someone? Because we got to get home. And Misty's like, Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back. And so finally, Misty's mother, she's very annoyed, but she stops the car, she does a 3-point turn, and she begins driving back up the road where they came from towards this girl. Now, they had only made it about a half mile from where Misty believed she had seen this girl. And so pretty quickly, they slowed down because Misty said, I think she's in this area, and they both began scanning the right side of the road because that's where she's going to be now that they've turned around. Now, it was starting to get very dark outside, but there was enough light, and they had headlights. They were pretty confident they'd be able to spot this girl. And so as they're slow rolling down the road, they both see this girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother made a comment that it was a little bit surprising that this girl was out here. I mean, there's really nothing around here. There's no houses, there's no buildings, there's no trails to be walking in this forest on either side. It was just kind of thick forest. And so she just thought it was very strange that this girl would even be out here, especially because there's not any traffic on this road. And so Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her, and she told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. And so as they got right up next to her, they realized she was not a little girl. She was a young teenager, but she was not a young child. And as they drove right past her, they would expect her to turn around and acknowledge the car creeping up on her, considering there's no other traffic in the area and you're just some person sitting on the side of the road. You should definitely turn around and see what's behind you. But the girl did not acknowledge them. She just continued to have her knees up to her chest and rocked back and forth. And so Misty and her mother are a little bit freaked out by this, but they drive past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother does a 3-point turn, and when they're looking back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they're oriented back towards their house now, she wasn't there anymore. But there were no street lights. It was now almost completely pitch dark outside, and so all they had was the headlights. And so Misty told her mom, drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights. And so Misty's mom began driving down the road and kind of turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to the left, but there was no sign of this girl. For good measure, they turned right slightly to shine the lights more to the right-hand side of the road, but there was no sign of this girl. And so Misty and her mother just slow rolled back down the road, kind of keeping their eye out on both sides. But after traveling for several minutes, going about 5-10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of this girl, they decided that, well, she must have just gone back into the woods and gone back to wherever it was she came from. And so Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they'd seen this girl, and they were coming up to this 4-way intersection with stop signs all around. And as they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped because on the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was this girl sitting on the side of the road. She's got her back to the road, her knees are up, and she's rocking back and forth. And so Misty's mother pulls up the stop sign and then just sits there. And both women are just stunned at what they're looking at. They had just seen her 2-3 miles back down the road. It wasn't possible for her to get all the way up here. And so Misty's mother looks at her daughter and says, do you think it's a different girl? And Misty's like, no, that's the same girl. And so they just sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. And she said to her mom, don't stop. I got a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl. But Misty's mom, she was definitely weirded out by this situation, no doubt. but she didn't feel good about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. And so even though she felt a little bit hesitant herself, she told Misty, we have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do. And Misty was not having it. She said, "Mom, do not stop. I got a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl." But Misty's mom let up off the brake and began slow rolling past this intersection. And now at this point, Misty is just absolutely terrified. And so she takes her seatbelt off and she goes down into the footwell right in front of her seat. And she closes her eyes and covers her ears, and she just continues to beg her mother to just please keep going. Don't stop. But her mother just continues on until she stops right next to this girl who's still just sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road. She's got her knees up. She's rocking back and forth. She's not acknowledging Misty or her mother. And so Misty's mother turns to her daughter and says, "Please roll down your window." And Misty refuses. She's still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position. She's crying and she's still begging her mother to please just go home. And so Misty's mother, frustrated, reaches across the passenger seat and grabs the knob to roll down the window manually. So she rolls the window down, and Misty, who's down in the footwell, all she remembers is sitting there covering up her ears, and she's crying, and she opens her eyes and she's looking up towards her mom, who's reaching over the seat, and her mom yells out to this girl. And Misty remembers looking at her mom, who suddenly recoils in horror and screams, and then they take off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumps out of the footwell and she's looking at her mom and she's like, "What's happening? What just happened? What did you see?" And her mom's got her hand over her mouth and she's speeding down the road and she's crying now. And she's looking at Misty and she just doesn't have the words to describe what she just saw. And so Misty's asking her mom, "What did you see? What happened?" And finally her mother just said, "She didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me." And so Misty screams and she's crying and her mom is crying, and they speed home. They're home just a couple of minutes later, and they run inside, practically falling over each other to get in the house. And as soon as they get inside, Misty's mom calls 911, and she didn't even know how to describe what she just saw. But she knew it was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. And so she just told the police that they had seen a girl they think needs help. And so the police, they went out and they searched that entire stretch of highway. They looked for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic that in the rare times he got a chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent outdoorsman. And so for this trip, he decided he would stay way off any trail, deep in the backcountry in random locations. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. He ate some food over his fire, he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes, he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals or maybe one animal moving around right outside. And so after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. There was no fire in his fire pit. And the guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down. And periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do. So he's just looking at him through this little tiny gap in his tent. And this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him. And the guy's eyes go wide and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this. And so he just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for this guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I am in the middle of nowhere in the backcountry of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite. Maybe he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees. Any light source anywhere out there he would see. And there's not one. There's no fire. There's no flashlight. There is nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he zips it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, And after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, albeit rare because we're in the backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here and, stranger things have happened, so that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about. He packed up his campsite and he began hiking into the forest. Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. He found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. And he's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything. And he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him. And this time, he can't really just write it off. Clearly, there is something behind him that's moving around. And so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods. But instead, he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. Because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone. And clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking in random directions for 15 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, "I don't know where Bell's Canyon is." And then there's silence. And Matt, one part of him is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light. I hope he just goes away. The other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time.
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
This time, Matt did not respond. Now he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out here, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of this situation. And so he took a deep breath, he reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion, he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. He was hiding from him. And when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away. And Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days. And so for several minutes, Matt just stood there absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was just a complete standstill. And then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt. And when he came through asking the same question,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
his voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough. He's gonna fall, get hurt, he's gonna get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away. And so Matt just goes back to his campsite and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am because I didn't chart a course. I didn't tell anyone where I was going to be. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours, he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again. He didn't see him again. And he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. And so he climbed in his tent and he had a very restless next couple of hours. And then the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day, Matt just felt like he was being watched, he was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. And so he found a clearing in the trees, he set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent, and he knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet. And so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulder, knowing this guy is following him. At this point, it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He was just too far away. And so at some point when it got too dark to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, grabbed his knife, and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there. And so Matt climbed inside of his tent, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife, and he sat there, expecting to hear this guy come walking around. But after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone, finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds. And he would stop periodically and moan and grunt, and he'd pick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved. And he peeled out of the parking lot. He got to a nearby hotel. He finally got cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about this guy, but he thought, what am I going to tell them? He didn't commit a crime. He was just terrifying. And so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington state who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the like button, tie them up, and then forcibly brush their teeth, and then make them drink orange juice. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift. And it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that it threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. On July 12, 2015, 30-year-old Christopher LeCun was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first, but as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be an underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater, and they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided, it's inconsequential. We can just go down and check it out for ourselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over and read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris didn't read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there wasn't just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so Chris and Robert looked at each other and they're totally amazed at what they're looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they'd spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. They were almost like windows at the top of the structure. And across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate, protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of the structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so Chris is really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabs the mesh itself and just kind of tries to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move, to maybe create some space so he could look inside. And it very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he and Robert to go through. And so the two of them look at each other and they just nod because they know they want to go inside and see what's in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space, this 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was this 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they couldn't see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris goes down first, followed by Robert, and as they start making their way down, they both start to feel a current that's pulling them straight down. And as soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position. The current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face. Because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he's going to encounter some very powerful pump that's sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that has something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. And in both of those situations, once Chris reaches the end of this tunnel, he's going to get cut up and get killed. And so Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And so he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this just nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly sees a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction they're being pulled towards. And all he can think of is, okay, well, whatever that light is, that's the area where I'm going to get killed. There's going to be some pump or some turbine right out there. And so he's bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as they got closer and closer and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture every time he would tumble around. He'd get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where instead of just pulling the water in directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be, a pump of death or spinning turbines or something like that, instead there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped, and then after a while that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. So Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built, because many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they didn't put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes, and the power plant has countered by saying, we put up enough deterrents, you just went past them on purpose. As of now, it's unclear what came of that court case. In 1990, 46-year-old Alex Kirstich was a marine biology high school teacher by day and a documentary filmmaker by night. In July of that year, he and 3 of his friends were in Mexico working on a documentary about sea life in the Gulf of California. They had already shot a bunch of footage during the daytime, and now they needed to go out and get some nighttime footage as well. On the evening of the 25th, Alex and his 3 friends boarded a 70-foot research vessel with all of their diving and camera equipment. They waited until just before sunset to leave the harbor, and then it was a 30-minute transit to this area just north of La Paz that they had been told was very active at night. Once the ship was stopped, they threw their anchor down and then turned on these bright spotlights and aimed them into the water. And then one of the ship's crew members put a big piece of tuna onto his fishing rod and then cast it out into the water to try to lure some animals to the area. A few moments later, a black mass suddenly came up to the surface, ripped the tuna from the line, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alex and his 3 friends didn't get a good look at it. They saw it happen, but they had no idea what it was. So they told the ship crew member to put another piece of tuna on the line, throw it out there, and see if they can get a better look at this thing. And so more tuna was put on the rod, it was cast out, and then seconds later, a black mass rushed up to the surface, grabbed the tuna, and then went back down again. But this time, with Alex and the others looking really intently at it, they picked up what looked like a red and white flash, like a strobe light on the skin of this creature as it descended down below. And they looked at each other and they thought, could it be? And so another piece of tuna was put on the fishing rod, they cast it out into the water, and this time, before anything could come up and take it, deep down below, they see a flash of red and white all over the place, like a bunch of strobe lights going off. And then dozens of these creatures rocketed to the surface, fought over this tuna, and then descended back down into the deep water. And so now the men look at each other and they're grinning because they know the red and white flashing they are seeing is a trademark of a very rare creature. It's their skin changing colors. It's how they communicate with each other. And this creature is so rare that at this time, no one had actually filmed it alive. There was only footage of it dead after it washed up on shore. And so suddenly Alex and his team are thinking, man, our documentary is about to become legendary if we can just get in there and get the footage. And so the men eagerly put on their dive equipment, got their cameras, and prepared to enter the water. Had they consulted with anyone who studied this rare creature, they would have been told that getting in the water with them was a horrible idea and could easily get them killed. These rare creatures are called Humboldt squids, and they are 8-foot long apex predators that live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Because they almost never come up to the shallow waters, we know very little about them. What we do know is that, like all other squids, they have 8 arms along with 2 long tentacles that have all these suckers on it, and inside of the suckers are these teeth, these little daggers that they use to latch onto their prey, and then they pull their prey in towards their center, and at their center is this opening. It's their mouth, and it's called a beak, and it literally looks like a bird's beak. It's this hard thing that sits there and opens and shuts, and they use it to bite into their prey. And then inside of their beak is their tongue, and on their tongue are hundreds of sharp little daggers like more teeth that they also use to shred their prey. Typically, these jumbo squid will sneak underneath their prey and then suddenly shoot up, grab them with their 2 tentacles, and then drag them down to the deeper water where they feel safe. And then they begin the horrifyingly slow process of eating their prey alive because they have a gag reflex that prevents them from eating quickly. Humboldt squids are very intelligent, they're very social, and they're very aggressive towards humans, especially when they are in a large group or when they are eating. But of course, Alex and his 3 friends are not thinking about this. They're just eager to get into those jumbo squid infested waters and get this footage. And so they give each other the final okays. They're ready, their equipment's good to go, and they slip off the side of the boat into the water. Once they were in the water, they sank down to 30 feet, at which point they spread out around the squid that were still darting up to the edge of the boat to try to get more tuna. After a few minutes of Alex and his buddies taking this great footage of these squids, a 14-foot shark suddenly comes into the mix and tries to eat the tuna off the side of the boat. But ironically, on its way out after not getting any tuna, the shark got its tail fins stuck on the actual hook and then became bait for the Humboldt squids. And seconds later, these squids began ripping the shark apart. And so Alex and his 3 friends decided to move closer to the drama to get some great footage. As Alex is right up next to this drama unfolding, he feels himself suddenly sinking in the water. And he's kind of fixated on getting the shot, so he's not really worried about why he's sinking. He's thinking maybe my buoyancy compensator compensators off, maybe my weights are too heavy. But when he looks down, he realizes in horror, a Humboldt squid has wrapped one of its tentacles around his right swim fin. And so he instinctively begins kicking the squid's tentacle with his left leg. He gets it to release him, and in a panic, Alex begins swimming back up towards the surface. But he's still 40 feet away at this point from the boat. And at this point, the other squid had been alerted to Alex as now being considered prey. And so as Alex is going up, from behind, another squid comes up and wraps its tentacle around his neck. And his neck was the only area on his body that was not protected by his neoprene wetsuit. And so the daggers inside of these suckers on this tentacle dug into his neck, all around his neck. So his neck's being cut into and he's being strangled and being pulled down by this squid. And so Alex begins punching and squeezing and pulling on this tentacle, fighting for his life. And he manages to get this squid, the second one, also to release him. But by now he's been pulled down to 50 feet. He's got a ways to go to get back to the boat. And the other squid are all coming over. They're converging on him because they're all communicating that here's our prey, here's our other meal. And so Alex tries to swim as fast as he can back to the boat, but he only made it a few feet before another Humboldt squid darted up and came right up to his face, wrapped both tentacles around his entire head, blinding him, and he immediately felt the beak pressed up against his face, and it was opening and closing, trying to bite him, but it was biting down on his dive mask that was basically saving him from having his skull crushed by this squid. The squid became frustrated because it's not digging into Alex's flesh, and so it readjusted its grip on him by sliding down to his midsection, where immediately it begins pulling him down violently in these pulsing bursts. And so all Alex starts doing is punching and hitting and doing everything he can to get this thing off of him. And then for some reason, it does release him. Maybe it was just so frustrated that it could not puncture into him. And so Alex is now down to about 60 feet, and he starts swimming as fast as he can with all these squids all around him. But for some reason, none of them attacked him. And so Alex swims up to the boat, and before he actually gets on board, he looks down back into the water, and there's just dozens of these squids that are flashing red and white at each other, just kind of hovering in the water, not making any move towards him. It was like they were just watching him. Alex sprinted up that ladder, got into the boat, and shortly after, his three friends came out of the water as well. They were unharmed. Alex had deep cuts all around his neck from where the tentacles had driven their teeth into his throat, but besides that, he was physically okay. Mentally, he was a train wreck and was very traumatized from this event, as you could imagine. Today, his encounter with the jumbo squids is a thing of legend in the diving community. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if they know where Bell's Canyon is. Winter of 1748, Timothy Dexter was born in a town just north of Boston, Massachusetts called Malden. Despite being incredibly dim-witted, Timothy always believed he was going to strike it rich one day. But looking around at his family, who were a bunch of poor farm laborers, Timothy realized he would need to make some big moves if he wanted that dream to become a reality. When he was just 8 years old, he decided he would make the first of his many big moves. And this move was to drop out of second grade and go to work on a farm and then on to a leather tannery. For years, he worked hard, earning more money than his family had ever made, but he knew this line of work was not going to make him rich. And so when he was 19 years old, he decided it was time to make yet another big move. He sold his best suit and used the money to relocate farther north to another Massachusetts town called Newburyport. He believed with their booming economy, he was bound to make some additional money there. And he was right, but his payday would not come from a higher paying job. When he arrived there, he met a lonely, wealthy widow named Elizabeth Frothingham, and he promptly married her, becoming rich overnight. After moving into her mansion and dubbing himself Lord Timothy Dexter, he suddenly felt lost. He had spent his entire life pursuing wealth, and now that he suddenly had it, he didn't know what to do with it. And so he looked around Newburyport at the other rich people and saw what they were doing, and he found that many of them held political positions. And so Timothy decided he would run for office too. But unfortunately, the voters caught on to the fact that he was a second grade dropout who couldn't read or write or think critically, so he didn't win the election. But instead of accepting his defeat, Timothy began petitioning the town to let him have his political office anyways. And the town said, no, that's not how democracy works. But Timothy didn't really understand, and he just continued to send these carefully outlined petitions explaining exactly why they needed to appoint him. The town had to bring in experts that were able to decipher what he wrote, because Timothy was deeply illiterate, and his petitions were so riddled with spelling mistakes and were so confusing that at first glance it looked like it was written in a foreign language. After they deciphered them, they would immediately deny them, but Timothy just continued to send them. And so finally the town got so fed up with all of his petitions that they decided they would just give him a fake political title just to get him to stop, and to low-key humiliate him. They offered him the title of the Informer of Deer, and they told him his job was to look high and low all over Newburyport for any signs of deer activity. And the joke was, in Newburyport, there are no deer. But Timothy did not find this humiliating. He did not see the joke in it. He took it very seriously and believed his petitions had worked. And so he took his political title, and with great enthusiasm, he got to work, spending all hours running all around the town, carefully documenting all deer activity, of which there was none. At the end of his term, Timothy felt like he had accomplished a lot as the Informer of Deer and was ready to move on from political office. And so he turned in his official Informer of Deer logbook to the town and told them they should pass it along to the next Informer of Deer to get them up to speed. Unfortunately, when the town opened that logbook, they found it contained only crude pictures of deer and then illiterate ramblings about deer that were so difficult to decipher that even the experts weren't able to do it. And so the logbook was thrown away, and the Informer of Deer position was never filled again. Shortly after the American Revolutionary War broke out between the colonies in America and Great Britain, America began printing their own money to pay for their troops. But this money, called the Continental Dollar, it wasn't backed by silver or gold. It was just backed on the promise of future value if America won the war. That, combined with overprinting this money, led to rampant inflation, and very quickly the Continental Dollar was worthless. Some of the wealthy folk in Newburyport decided they would do the troops a favor who were now destitute because they held all of this worthless currency. And these wealthy people offered to buy all of their Continental currency for a fraction of the price, which was better than nothing. When Timothy saw all these rich people doing that, he quickly jumped on the trend. But he didn't view this as doing a favor for these troops that needed the money. He viewed this as a great investment opportunity. He believed America was going to win this war and that eventually this currency was going to have lots of value. And so he invested all of his savings into buying back the Continental Dollar. When word spread that Timothy had made this terrible investment, because at the time, nobody was predicting this currency would have any worth, really even if America won the war. When they found out that Timothy had made this ridiculous investment, his peers, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport, they were thrilled. They were so annoyed by Timothy, and they didn't like the fact that he was kind of on their level because he had some money. And so they were excited to see him go bankrupt. But sure enough, at the end of the American Revolution, when America won the war, Congress made good and backed the currency, making Timothy one of the richest people in America overnight. Right away, Timothy used his second big windfall of cash to purchase the most luxurious mansion in the richest neighborhood in all of Newburyport. But beyond that purchase, he didn't really know what to do with all of this money. It was very overwhelming. And so after several weeks of deep introspection where he tried to figure out, who he was now and what he wanted to be, it suddenly became clear to him. He needed to construct 40 wooden statues of random famous men on his front lawn. These statues included George Washington, Napoleon Bonaparte, Thomas Jefferson, and of course himself. The inscription under his statue read, "The first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." After a sculptor was done, Timothy went out to inspect all 40 statues, and he discovered what he believed to be a huge discrepancy on one of them. Underneath Thomas Jefferson's replica, it said the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is accurate. But he told his sculptor that he was supposed to put down the author of the Constitution. And the sculptor very gently said, "That's not right. It should be the Declaration of Independence." Timothy became irate. He was not having it, and so he ran into his mansion and came out with his oversized hunting rifle and began firing at the sculptor's feet until he made the change. After Jefferson's title was fixed, Timothy noticed another discrepancy on another statue. He walked over to the George Washington replica and looked underneath it at the inscription, which said George Washington. And Timothy just shook his head, got out a paintbrush, covered it up, and wrote one word: Pitt. Just Pitt. Because periodically Timothy would confuse George Washington's name with Pitt, and nobody could convince him otherwise. By now, the other wealthy folk in Newburyport had really grown to resent Timothy, and now he was just showing off his wealth with his totally ridiculous mansion and all of his statues, and so some of these aristocrats wanted to find a way to just ruin Timothy. And so, knowing he was not a very bright man, they decided they would start giving him deliberately terrible investment tips. The first being that he should buy a whole bunch of warming pans and send them to the Caribbean. A warming pan is like this big frying pan that you load up with hot coals and you slide under your bed to stay warm at night. This works really well in a cold environment like Newburyport, but is completely worthless in a warm tropical environment like the Caribbean. But Timothy believed he was being given some great insider trading information and absolutely took this to the bank. And he went and bought 2 ships and he loaded them up with 40,000 of these huge warming pans and he fired them off to the Caribbean. And when they got there, the locals didn't know what they were or what they were for, but they found these warming pans served as great ladles for molasses, and they all sold out for a huge profit. And so Timothy went to those aristocrats and he thanked them for their incredible investment tip. These rich people were furious that their plan had backfired, and so they decided they would pitch him another, even worse investment tip that was bound to ruin him. They told him, why don't you buy up a whole bunch of coal and send it to Newcastle, England? Newcastle being the coal capital of the world, where there was so much coal there was actually an expression at the time, that's like sending coal to Newcastle, which meant you're doing something completely pointless. But these fine rich folks had never done Timothy wrong, and so he took their advice and once again took it to the bank. He loaded up his ships with coal and he sent them off to Newcastle. And this would have ruined him had it not been for the coal workers' strike that occurred right before his shipment arrived. And so when Timothy's coal arrived on the shores of Newcastle, there was a coal shortage and all of his coal sold out for another huge profit. And so once again, Timothy went back to the aristocrats and said, thank you for the incredible advice. Now truly irate that their plan has backfired 2 times, these aristocrats got together and said, okay, we gotta set him up for something that's going to make him fail. And so they pitched him one more terrible investment tip. This was, hey Timothy, why don't you go buy all the whalebone you possibly can? Just hoard it, keep it in your house, because someday it's gonna get really valuable. At the time, whalebone was extremely expensive and losing its value every single day. But again, Timothy thinks these people have never done me wrong, I'm gonna do just that. And so he went out and he collected thousands of pounds of these rotting whale bones and made a huge stockpile in his basement. And shortly after he had built up this mountain of bone, over in France, it became fashionable for men to wear corsets. And wouldn't you know it, these corsets were made out of whalebone. And so once again, Timothy's investment completely paid off. And so he tipped his hat for a 3rd time to these rich folks that just keep making him more and more money. After these 3 big investment wins, Timothy was very confident and he viewed himself as a shrewd investor. And so he began to believe that he could identify winning investments himself. And so the first winning investment that he identified was to purchase all these stray cats in Newburyport that were lined up for euthanization. Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals would make great house pets in the Caribbean. And so he loaded them all onto his 2 ships, he fired them across the sea, and wouldn't you know it, they sold like hotcakes. Not because they were cute and cuddly, but because, unbeknownst to Timothy, the Caribbean had a huge rat infestation problem in their warehouses, and so his shipment of stray cats arrived at the perfect time. At some point, after all these successful investments, Timothy started to wonder about his legacy. How would people remember him after he was gone? And so there was only one way to find out. Timothy, very elaborately, faked his own death. And as he hid, watching his funeral, he noticed his wife, Elizabeth, wasn't as sad as he thought she should be over the death of her husband. And so he leapt out in front of the thousands of people that were there and he began beating his wife with his cane. After this, Timothy decided he didn't really like his wife anymore, and so he decided he would just tell people she was dead, even though she was not dead. And so when people came to Timothy's mansion and they saw his wife walking around, clearly alive, Timothy would tell them, oh, she's a ghost. And because at this point Timothy was so wealthy and so influential, people just kind of accepted this and began viewing Elizabeth as a ghost. Before Timothy's actual death, he penned an autobiography called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, a title that to this day people still don't really understand. Inside the book were 24 pages of completely illiterate ramblings with absolutely zero punctuation. The book was so terrible that it actually sold out very quickly because people thought it was funny to buy this book. After people criticized Timothy for not using any punctuation, Timothy printed a second edition where at the very end he included a single page with 13 lines of just random punctuation marks with a note at the bottom that said, "Go ahead and sprinkle these in as you see fit." In 1806, just a few years after publishing his book, Lord Timothy Dexter, the informer of deer, quietly passed away, this time for real. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and lightly toast all of their bread and then put it back in the bag. And so after several weeks of deep introspection about who he was and what he was going to be, it became clear to him. He needed... I can't even say it. He needed to build 40 wooden statues of random famous men. Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals... Timothy figured these mangy, sick, feral animals... These mangy, sick, feral animals would make Grace outfits.